Uh, Thank you, Praveen.
Right, Piyush, thank you.
Will and Christopher, thank you so much for the session. We will move on to the next session. And one of the components of Project Masoom's objective is to advocate to schools to adopt a CSA prevention policy and enable a response mechanism to the organization. Building safe environments and institutional abuse prevention and response is critical. Educating school leaders creates a multiplier effect towards preventing and ending child sexual abuse. ICMEC, headquartered in Virginia, is a world leader that provides the best tools and resources to the world's educators. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Laurie Tasharski, who shall be joining us from Washington, D.C. She is the Director of Global Center for Excellence at ICMEC. She facilitates educator training and oversees all aspects of ICMEC's Global Educator Center for Excellence and Education portal. This includes child protection programs and resources developed for international schools and youth-serving organizations. As a committee chair for the International Task Force for Children's Protection, she works closely with senior leaders across the education and child protection fields and trains on a variety of child protection topics internationally. Laurie has worked with education associations and schools in every region of the world. She has worked and lived in India too, and we have her today to learn about policies, implementation, and how to create safe environments for children through institutional abuse prevention and response. Welcome, Laurie, to Young Indians and to the YI Masoom Summit 2020.
Thank you so much, Piyush. I feel sure that whoever's left at the end of a fabulous two-day conference, at the very end of the day, is willing to sit and listen to a conversation about policy and institutional abuse are really the hardcore believers, and our policy wonks among you. I welcome you. I'm likewise a policy wonk, but I just want to thank you, the panelists, for an amazing session. I've really been enjoying listening in on it. And thanks also to all the participants who are still with us. And I hope to use this time to talk a little bit about how we engage not only youth-serving organizations, but how we engage organizations that serve youth-serving organizations. So both tiers are really critical. And as Piyush mentioned, I work for the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I want to let you know that for those of you working in the child protection field, that even when you have next door to your office someone working with law enforcement, and you work with child abuse physicians who work with healthcare providers, and you work with those who do judicial advocacy, multidisciplinary teams and conversations are always challenging. So even in the same office where we serve all of these various constituencies of professionals and practitioners working with children in response and prevention, those can be hard conversations. And so we spend a lot of time talking about what makes the conversation easier. So you will see here on this slide that we have an education portal that is educator facing and youth organization practitioner and professional facing. The contents of the education portal really run the gamut, all the way from recruitment and employment kinds of questions that you need to be asking, background checks, reference checks, and application processes, all the way through to youth and children's prevention education, so the curriculum side. And we do everything in between. Why am I here? I suspect that I'm here because of my involvement in the International Task Force for Child Protection, which created new international accreditation standards across the world. But essentially, the International Task Force was created because of the offending of one individual. This was a prolific offender. He offended all over the world. He was a sex offender in the United States before the age of 20. So he started in his late teens, was arrested, served time. That information was never conveyed and never reached those who provided his teaching license. And he went on to teach on 4 continents over 30 years and offended against hundreds of boys, teenage boys. One of the things that his offending highlighted for many people who are educators like myself is that there was a kind of response in the past that is simply not working. Institutions were focused on harmful people. There was a single point of decision making. There was no accountability, and reputation was the single most important aspect to be considered in a response for children. And if you looked at prevention, it didn't even really exist. What we know from a lot of amazing work done globally, Australia had a national inquiry on institutional abuse. The UK is currently involved in the IICSA. Their inquiry on institutional sexual abuse, Canada had done one before that. So a lot of research and conversation came out of those national inquiries. And what we know is that adults prefer and protect adults. We know that moving from a place where we prioritize children's safety, even in a school where it's part of our duty of care in the statutory guidance of almost every country in the world, we sometimes forget children's rights and we don't support them. And so what we knew we needed to do was go down to a fundamental level and talk about rights-based child protection with educators. Educators, as we know, have really important multiplier effect in the lives of children. So if you can intervene in abuse that's happening in school or be a trusted adult for a child to report abuse, you can stop it potentially before it worsens or happens. You can intervene for children who would in the future be highly vulnerable to multiple abuse events. So you're not just stopping, as I say to teachers, you're not just stopping the abuse today, you're stopping the abuse tomorrow, next month, next year, 5 years from now. And that is really powerful. We also know, of course, that a lot of abuse is happening in the schools. So that's another reason that educators are really key to solving this problem, which we know can be solved. So we, when we talk to youth serving organization professionals, we bring them into some of the theory of child protection. We look for an understanding and an agreement that this is not a cultural issue, that this is a child harm issue, and not this is our style, this is how we do it here. Also, we're moving away from this idea of, a single point of solution. We know that child harm is contextual. We know that if you take one offender or perpetrator or child who harms out of a situation, there might be others that just step right into that gap. So our focus is really on working with schools as the instrument to work between individual children, between families, and out into the community, that the duty of care of the school does not stop at the end of the school grounds, that they need to operate in the community and look beyond what is happening in the school. So what are the principles that the International Task Force signed up for or elaborated for all schools that they reach out to? That child protection is rights-based, that all of us are responsible, that this is not the job of just one person in the school or the school nurse, and that every response needs to operate from the best interest of the child. To bring these ideas into schools and to get schools to start thinking about issues around child protection from a different lens, which I think is the hardest part, is changing what you've done in the past to a new way. They broke their expectations into 4 categories to cover all areas of organizational child protection. So under the policy, I'm just going to mention again, I've already mentioned that it needs to be rights-based, and that gives us a common ground to have a discussion. We find that when we are working with children, that we start where we are. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. There are expectations, of course, on individuals. We need a robust, safer hiring, a robust vetting process for anyone who has the privilege to work with children. And that needs to include every single person in the organization, not just the ones that are delivering the program or the faculty. So that code of conduct, that pride in professionalism is where we are having our conversations in order to foster appropriate boundaries. One of the things I like to say to teachers, excuse me, is that if you are are using behaviors that harm your learning environment, you are damaging not just the job you're trying to do. So if you're using favoritism or giving gifts or using other grooming behaviors, you are also weakening the boundaries for a particular child so that when they go out into the world, their boundaries are weaker than when they started. So a coach, a neighbor, someone else who has a sexual interest in children is more likely to view that child as a target and to succeed. And I think this is the perspective that's helpful for educators. They don't want to do anything that would harm a child, but they need to understand that their actions could harm a child in the future. So training becomes a critical piece of this. And I will talk a little bit about what our training approaches are. From the procedural perspective, we understand and know through a lot of research and case study that multiple reporting pathways are critical in youth serving organizations, and the organization needs to have a response plan. So we spend a lot of time talking about how organizations build response teams, how they designate child protection leads or safeguarding leads, what internal pathways exist before we even start talking about how they're going to work with local authority. We want those processes in place because we want a prevention orientation. We want to catch things while they're low level. We want to catch grooming behavior, poor professional conduct, identify individuals who are unsuitable to work with children, as well as, of course, address other forms of abuse that might be happening in a child's life: physical abuse at home, witness to violence at home, neglect. We understand that the critical piece of policy and procedures is accountability. And certainly I think the central record, we know from, again, global examples of schools not adequately documenting low-level concerns, whether it be cases where it's peer-on-peer abuse and there's the presence of harmful sexual behaviors against other children. We know that those escalate. If those can be identified early, intercepted with safety planning, triggers can be identified, we know recidivism rates are very low for children who are acting out or harming other children sexually. So the central record is critical for justice as well, and to support allegations when someone has a suspicion. The fact that it's documented, the fact that we can see if there's persistence or resistance to correction, all of those are really important tools for employers, for educators to make decisions about whether someone is suitable to work with children. So the heart of what I wanted to talk to you about today is really this piece. How do we engage educators? There's a lot going on there. When we get a room full of teachers or administrators, school heads in the room, we understand that they have seen, they have suspected. You cannot have a class of 30, 40, 50 in front of you and not know who that neglected child is. They stick out. We see a group of children at one time in a classroom. We have suspicions about physical abuse. We have suspicions about sexual abuse commonly. And if in the past we haven't handled them the way we should have, if we aren't aware of what the signs and indicators are, we don't know the prevalence or the myths, we may have done the wrong thing. We may have overlooked it. We may not have acted when we should. And so it's important to go into these trainings and conversations with a non-judgmental perspective. You know, we are not looking back at what you did in the last 10 years of your career or 20 years of your career. We're looking forward. And also understanding that in any room, and anyone who trains on child protection is aware of this, that we have survivors and supporters of survivors among us. And so we need to invite our participants to understand that there may be strong emotions related to training, that they may have biases. Even as a survivor, my journey is not the same as your journey, and what happened to me is not the same as what happened to a child who I'm working with. So it's important that we take those things out in a safe space and unpack them. I have mentioned that our shared beliefs are critical, these shared understandings, and really that's basic. That is, children cannot consent to abuse. All adults are responsible, that children can be impacted beyond the walls of our school, and that we have a responsibility to any child impacted by the operations of our organization. So if we have an employee who's harmed a child outside of our school, it is very much our problem, and not something that we can say, well, it didn't happen here, or it's not one of our students, so therefore we wouldn't get involved. Of course, we need to make sure, probably more than any other professional practitioner outside of child protection, that those serving children understand how institutional abuse works. They need to understand offender modus operandi. They need to really understand the kinds of motivations, the kinds of rule breaking that they will be seeing. And that's important all the way from the HR professional who hires the person, all the way through to colleagues who might be working with someone with a sexual interest in children. I've already mentioned looking forward, and the last piece of what our organization aims to do is to provide tested tools and resources. We understand that it's not enough for someone to take a computer course and really understand this. There has to be conversation around it, case review. We also understand that as we're talking to school heads and leaders, that we need to support their deeper learning. So we have spent a lot of time thinking about practice groups, working groups, country networks or city networks, so that multiple schools who might be competitors in the space or work in different sections of a city come together regularly for professional development, that this is a non-compete area, that we do not compete in child protection. We share our learning, and all the schools are lifted, because you may have a student who's acting out sexually, who you decide to kick out of your school. That student's going to another school. You may have a student in your school who has been sexually harmed or physically harmed by an employee of the school, or by another student in the school. And we know from case review that very often they end up leaving the school. So they go somewhere else. So that traumatized child is then going somewhere else. You have information about their vulnerability that needs to be conveyed to the next set of professionals working with that child. So there's quite a lot on the back end that needs to be addressed. So I'm moving into the portion of my talk where I show you some of the things that we use to talk to educators. One is the disclaimer that I mentioned to you already, this idea that we take a beat to unpack our biases and understand that if someone needs to step away from training or leave the room, that we're not going to ask them why, that we're going to try and anonymize cases to protect the privacy of children, and that we're not going to share someone else's story because it belongs to them. I've already mentioned that we start with a base of rights-based child protection, so that we're starting from a place, even though we may be from different cultures, different child experiences, have different life experiences of harm, we are starting from these basic assumptions of children's rights and agency. It's really important, as those of you who do training understand, to start with definitions, to talk about terminology so that we're using the right language. What is harm, abuse, violence? We explain that those are all synonyms, that in the child protection space, we usually use the word violence. I do tend to use the word harm. I think it's easier for people for whom, when we talk about child protection, they are thinking of a specific child. And I think fear and strong emotions can intercept learning. And so we sometimes use these gentler words for professionals who are actually imagining their own children. And I think this is helpful for parents as well, when they're imagining their own children in a position of harm, to use a softer word, but we're very deliberate about why we're using it. And we encourage them to use non-minimizing language when they're dealing with cases. We understand that harm includes many facets, and in order to work with youth serving organizations, I think it's important to also address physical, emotional abuse as well, because that is what they're seeing. Obviously, neglect most common, they're seeing that. So to say, no, I'm not going to talk to you about these other things that may be vulnerability factors for children, I'm only going to talk to you about sexual abuse or employee sexual abuse, I think is not helpful. I think our organization decided that it's better to address all forms, and that's the strongest way to walk into prevention. We also really want to stress that your institution is playing a role in both preventing abuse and in appropriate response. We cover, really, these essentially are the forms of abuse we cover, but of course we address female genital mutilation, we address child marriage, we address child labor, other forms of abuse that may be present in the countries where we are working. Extremism is another example of a form of a child protection concern that we would want schools to be switched onto. We make sure they understand that children cannot consent and teach them the language around that. We talk about compliant victims, not children consenting to abuse themselves. We, of course, address the ACEs. And I think one of the things that a lot of educators don't understand is that when you look at cases, very often the children involved, it's the victims who end up leaving education. It's the victims who end up leaving the school. And often there are immediate and short and long-term educational and academic disruption caused by harm. And I think that's important to understand for educators. One of the things I think that can be the most sobering is a discussion around prevalence. So if I'm working with a school and they have 1,400 students or 2,000 students, and I say in the US, we use a figure 1 in 7 children are impacted by childhood sexual abuse. Europe, 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 4 boys, and India, as you know, 1 in 2. If we think about the size of our student body, this is happening in our organization. So it is happening here. It's far beyond it can't happen here. It is happening here. And I think that's really sobering and a great way to bring them to the table to say you need to devote more resources to this problem. More time to building your knowledge, more staff to understanding and being engaged in appropriate response. One of the things we do talk about a lot, and this is leading into some of the myths, are that 1/3 to 2/3, depending on the country, of the children who are harming, the people who are harming are children. And of course, the statistics we all know about the perpetrators being known to the child. This last stat is from a US study in 2004. It was done on adults. It was a random adult study, and 10% of all adults said that they experienced some form of sexual abuse by an employee of their school. And this is a US statistic. We know, of course, that number would be higher in other countries where you still are seeing a lot of corporal punishment in schools. I'm just showing an animation. The reason I use this with educators is I want them to understand who they are. And they are these people. They are these people who are standing to the side, and there is some indication that something is wrong. There are signs and indicators that that child is going through something. And that they have the power to, and well, not only do they have the power, they have a legal and moral role to play in order to prevent immediate short-term and long-term harm. And I think the idea here too is that instead of having a student come or disclose or to have a suspicion about something happening in your institution, is to understand that the institution also covers those offenders. It covers those, if it's a family member, the institution is still a part of that. The child is a part of the institution. So for them to overcome not wanting to harm their school, their classmates, their teacher, their family is always in play when it comes to interacting with and adjudicating cases in schools. One of the things that I felt as a teacher when I was a classroom teacher is that we were told, you're a mandatory reporter, this is the law, and you have a duty of care, and these two things you should do. And what we know from child abuse cases is that they are very seldom clear. Very often those two things will be in conflict. The best interest of the child versus my role as a mandatory reporter can often be in conflict. And so I think we walk into this conversation saying, this is nuanced, this is complicated. We may be balancing our thresholds, right? Whether if we have high thresholds or low thresholds, what are we going to respond to? And I think real talk is critical when you're working with youth serving professionals. So I have a poll here that I may not be able to launch, but I think someone else can probably launch for me. These are the questions if we don't have the poll. Just checking the time. Can we launch that poll? If we can't launch the poll, I want you just to think for a minute about you as a supporter of youth serving organization, or maybe even a direct child serving professional. So ask yourself, if I know the signs and indicators of all forms of abuse. If you don't, I would submit to you that it's your responsibility to know them. I know who to tell in my organization about suspicion or disclosure of abuse. And I would submit to you, even if you're not a direct child serving organization, you need to know who you would report to. These organizations need to have child protection policies, outreach, training. It's important to walk the talk if you are serving a school or youth serving organization. I know what to do as a first responder to a child's disclosure of abuse. If you have contact with children in your work, you are a potential trusted adult, and you need to know how to respond to a disclosure of harm. I think also it's quite important that we understand that when an allegation comes forward or a concern comes forward, that the organization is mobilized, which is appropriate, but is also defensive, that we don't want this to be true. No one wants to see a child harmed. And unless we unpack those feelings and emotions, they can color how we view the situation. That child also doesn't want this to have happened. We look at victim statements and we see they say things like, "I didn't believe it myself." And very often when I talk to educators, I say, think of the most beloved, admired teacher in your school, and think of the most challenging student, the student who acts out, who tells lies, who gets in trouble, who hurts other kids. Those are the two people who are going to be involved in this case. The person you love and admire, and the student who everyone realizes is unreliable and challenging. And you need to be able to accept that. And I think we have a long way to go as an education community, an international education community, to understand that our actions are impacted by a set of ethics that we need to have. Of course, we already know that they're impacted by the law, but that those things need to combine to create a climate and a culture of prevention and protection. And this is not easy. We know from decades of trying it that this doesn't happen automatically. So it's really important to pick apart the areas where we can add value. And I just want to say to all the participants, thank you for being those people who can begin to highlight areas where we can add value. I mentioned earlier the education portal. This is the landing page. I think you will see that we cover all areas here. And normally I ask people to pull out their devices right now, wherever you are, and go to your browser and put in Education Portal ICMEC, or you can use our short link here, edportal.icmic.org, or put your phone on that QR code and follow the link and have a little click around. Browse, if you're on a phone, the yellow, this information is a yellow bar on the bottom, and that will make the screen scroll downward. You'll see that we have a number of areas where you can find tools and support. And one of those areas is in reporting and support. In addition to the reporting mechanisms that are global there, including India, you will see support for those in organizations serving children who are victims, their families, and children who have harmed or have exhibited problematic sexual behavior, as well as incident response. In incident response, at the top, you'll see sort of general tools. In the middle, peer-on-peer abuse specific tools. And at the bottom, you'll find guidance for adult sexual misconduct. And one that we highlight quite often is the Managing Allegations Protocol. This was written by the International Task Force. ICMIC was a part of that, as well as many international law enforcement agencies, international legal firms, and other nonprofits. So in the end, what we want to leave schools with is that it is happening in your school, that false allegations are rare, but it can be prevented. We know that because offenders have worked in this school and that school, but only offended here. So we know we can create situational safety for children, even when there's a motivated or preferential offender in the school. How is this done? Multiple barriers. We need all of these things. Policies need to be lived and socialized in the school. All adults in the school need to be engaged and observant. And of course, young people need to have agency and voice within the organization. You can have the best policy and program in the world, the most expensive training, everything can be perfect, but if you are not valuing student voice and agency, young people are not going to see you as trusted adults, and they're not going to report. This is just, I'm leaving you with this just to give you a sense of how this is shaped. I want to point out that really we don't start with student engagement. We start with leadership, policies, procedures, resourcing. Who is in the institution? The most risky situation you can have is to have someone with a sexual interest in children in your organization. So your entire hiring process needs to be designed in order to screen out harmful people and screen in professionals and the kind of people who are safe and will keep children safe. Moving through, once you have your leadership piece in place, you move through training, you begin to, you have induction training and whole school training, and you start digging down into the special skills and competencies needed by HR professionals, counselors, athletic directors, and senior leadership teams. And then you start to bring in, you're getting your procedures in place. You start with parent signposting, where resources are, start supporting parents is again where they are, having discussions. We know that a counselor standing in the front of the room and wagging their finger at parents and telling them that they shouldn't hit them is just simply not going to work. That we need a parent outreach program that is based on facilitation and conversation and shared values. And then finally, you are going to put curriculum in place that will be student prevention, education. The reporting pathways are already in place. So when this curriculum is implemented, children have a person to report to who will not re-traumatize them in their response because they're already trained. And that is when you start looking at environmental audits, you start looking at safety surveys, only once your system is ready. So I would just submit to you that we all have something we need to work on, something we need to learn a little more about as a school or an organization, but also as an individual. I think it is our responsibility, if we have the privilege of working with children and young people, that we are the bearers of that knowledge, that other people will be looking to us to enforce boundaries when children cross them, but also to help our colleagues and other professionals enforce appropriate boundaries. And finally, this doesn't happen overnight. You can't buy this on a shelf. You can't call someone up and have them come to your school and put it in place. These are steps that take place. It's a process. It happens over years. There are many supports needed for professionals doing this work. So I would say to my nonprofit colleagues that ideas that you have that support professionals, this is money well spent. This is critical engagement and critical constituencies for you to reach out to. Thank you all. I think I'm.
Yeah, Laurie.
How am I on time? I really flew through that.
Thank you, Laurie. I just have a quick question. We have about 5 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to focus on India, as in you have spent a considerable time working in India, schools in India. And apart from the international schools that are there in India, and if we are looking at the international accreditations, we also have schools with various standards across the social spread in India. Mm-hmm. And if I may add, there's a gap between mandate about implementing about framework, and then there's a there's a different challenge altogether while implementing it. So how do you look at that, and what are your experiences about the schools as they are in India, considering their approach towards combating CSA?
Yeah. So as you know, just I get afraid to generalize in India. I lived in New Delhi, so that is the area that I know. I wouldn't presume to speak to, every state is so different, and the progress that's being made can sometimes be so local. So some I think it can be quite ad hoc too. Some schools take it on. They may have survivors in their leadership. It may be something they really prioritize. One thing I realize is that many adults come to education because they were harmed by someone in education. I think it's a little bit of a survivor response to reclaim that space and make it safe for someone else. To have your experience translate to safety is a way that survivors can recover. So I think it can be, to be honest, Piyush, all the way down to a classroom level. You might have great work happening, grassroots kind of, coaches or athletic directors who want to do more and are learning more on their own. And that's filtering up to school principals and superintendents. And then on the other side, clearly we know that there's quite a few nonprofits doing excellent work within community training, community awareness raising, and small pilot programs to engage not just educators, but young people as Young Indians has done. So I think it's really hard to speak generally. I had a very dual experience. I lived in India, in Delhi for 5 years. I worked in with a nonprofit teaching in a juggi, and I also worked at an elite international school. And what I saw, to be honest, was that there was, and I left India in 2012. So things have changed, and I hope and I'm sure they have changed for the better. I follow the headlines avidly and keep my eye on what's developments are happening. And I'm very proud at some of the big steps that have been made in India. But I think there's a general trust for adults. And I think we very often put someone in a position that they're not prepared for, whether it's professionally or as volunteers. And I know you're a volunteer-based organization, and I think it's really important that people understand that if you have the privilege to walk into those communities and be seen as a trusted adult, you need to be amplifying the voice of the child. You need to be conveying safety, boundaries, and I think that this can come down to the individuals. I'm not sure, to be honest, that there is enough there requiring institution and organizations to take these steps. And sometimes, and we've certainly worked with colleagues and organizations that are regional organizations, when they put these steps into place and they make them mandatory and they say you have to have a policy and you have to have training and you have to have a response team or a child protection designate, that very often you have a lot of people just ticking the boxes. And so when you're out there sort of changing hearts and minds, you're going out and you're having conversations, doing your awareness raising piece, it's important to realize that there are going to be some who just want to fulfill the minimum obligation, the least the law requires, I call it. They're doing the least the law requires rather than the most the law allows. And I think that needs to be a fundamental switch in the way all of us are thinking and expecting, so that as a school, if you have 10 partners in the community and you're working with them, you need to say to them, what's your child protection policy? How are you vetting employees? These need to be questions that we're asking each other so that we're saying, oh, okay, I need to be doing more. So I can't really answer your question about sort of India as a whole, or where I think the governmental or even the teacher accreditation, teacher training needs to go. But certainly, because I think every state is different, much like the United States, where every state has a different kind of set of standards. But I do think that whatever we can do to get the conversation going, to be raising it as if it's completely normal to be talking about this.
Laurie, as a closing statement for the session, once an organization is convinced that it needs to come in and have a policy related to child protection, uh, what would be the next step, as in the immediate thing that an organization could do, as in to bring in a small policy statement at least? If you could close with a statement about that policy part.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And I think actually it becomes even more important that every job description, every direct child serving professional needs to have child protection in their job description. And a code of conduct is almost more important than the policy. How we behave, what is acceptable? One-on-one child contact, is that acceptable? Favoritism, is that acceptable? Giving gifts, seeing children out of the program, are those things professional? Making decisions based on a personal preference rather than an educational purpose, that needs to be decided among the professionals. Because what I have seen is that someone will write it, or the board will write it, or a consultant will come in and write it, and then it will be handed out to all the teachers, and there's 44 things they now need to do. And they will say to them, okay, read this and sign it, and then we'll go on with our meeting. This is not a process that's going to result in any kind of prevention. So I would just say that starting with your code of conduct and your conversations around children's rights and safety, moving into policy, and then from policy, really taking that forward to looking at all of your systems, what reporting looks like in the school, who is resourced to handle cases, because as cases bubble up, as everyone in this call knows, it is very hard to reach the threshold of local authority. Because you will have children sitting on teachers' lap, you will have offending in plain sight, you will have low-level sexual harassment, you'll have other things that are explained away by adults or are not meeting the threshold of local authority. So the response lies within the organization. And I know this is wrapping up the whole 2 wonderful days of meeting together, and I think and I will let you probably more eloquently do that wrap up, but I do want to say that the single most important thing that all of us are doing is what we're doing right now, and that is to have a conversation, to continually have a conversation and to say that we need to do better, and we will do better.
Totally agree with you, Laurie. It starts with a conversation, and then it's a step-by-step approach towards eradicating CSA. For supporting the Masoom Summit and talking about how institutional abuse differs from the normal other forms of abuse. And you clarified about the role that we play in preventing and responding to abuse. You have also highlighted about the standards, about the policy, about how people can come in and how accountability can be brought into institutions. I believe that these insights are definitely going to help us to start thinking about what areas schools and organizations need to work upon to stop institutional abuse and provide appropriate response to an incident of child sexual abuse. Thank you, Laurie. It was a pleasure having you on this platform. Thank you. Thank you so much. Moving ahead, I would like the summit as a way forward. It has been 2 wonderful days of ideation, exchange of best practices, and knowledge sharing at the Masoom Summit. It reminds us that to value and protect the innocence of children is to value and protect society itself. It is an investment into the future. This Summit brought together leading organizations from across the globe to talk about the problem of child sexual abuse and share possible solutions that could be or have been successful elsewhere in the world. We have had leaders from We Protect Global Alliance, Microsoft, Australian eSafety, UNICEF, SAVEC, government representations, ARPAN, LEGO, and ICMEC. We also saw child and young voices participate at the summit. Yesterday, Smita set the background for what this summit aims to achieve: a collective response with partnerships and collaborations where we all together walk the talk. This summit has clearly reinforced that CSA is a global priority, which has been further worsened during the pandemic. Children have become more vulnerable and the new post-pandemic world will call for collective collaboration, not just for physical CSA, but for online prompted CSAM as well. Children and adolescents, digital awareness in the age of media has a deep impression, which needs to be understood very well by us adults, so that we can put in place appropriate safeguards for the protection at all levels. The vulnerability arises not just from outside offenders, but most of the content is self-made by children themselves. And the dilemma lies in how to balance the internet use between being an essential service, that is an online shopping or banking experience, a learning tool as in education, and entertainment learning leaning skewedly towards exploitation as a process. The key takeaways from the Masoom Summit that I can point out here are that we need to focus on prevention, that there has to be a collective global action and response. We need knowledge sharing, collaborations, and partnerships at multi-stakeholder level. Tech companies play an important role with innovations, research, transparency, and accountability coming in. Participation of children and adolescents in designing solutions to the problem and the need to empower them as agents of change is important. We need to give meaningful and dignified decision-making opportunities to children. It must not just be a matter of advocacy, but it must be a matter of child rights. They have the right to be the decision makers in the process. Play is like breathing to children. We must use play as a powerful tool to communicate with children and teach them about protecting themselves. And organizations need to work to stop institutional abuse and provide appropriate response to incidents of child sexual abuse. Now, what has become clear today is that CSA exists in many ways and across the globe. And we all are interconnected and dependent on each other to combat this menace. It requires individuals, organizations, and governments to come together and play their part in securing the future of children. Like Mr. Cornelius from UNICEF said, that India has led the way for the world in several developmental landmarks, and India has ample examples at grassroots levels which showcase change. The world now is looking up to the Indian population again to show the way. So as young Indians, it is our commitment and priority to converge the youth to protect children from all forms of sexual abuse and in all its settings. And the children deserve nothing less. To conclude, now I invite Smita Agarwal, National Vice Chair of Young Indians, to proceed with the summit closing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Piyush. I think this has been a brilliant 2 days, and we are all so proud of how far we've come and how much we've achieved. But I would not be wrong, I think, if I say that the journey has only just begun, and we've only managed to set out what is the task now that lies ahead of us. We have laid out an amazing plan. We have got so many insights, and just as you summarized right now, Piyush, we have understood what is the need of the hour, what are the critical interventions that need to come in because of also the changing scenario around us due to the pandemic. And I think we are all ready, and we are all very, very committed to this cause of keeping our children safe, keeping them protected, and building a better future for all the children across the world. And we will start this work with the zeal and enthusiasm as we've always done. And Masoom has always been a project that has been the closest to the heart of every young Indian. So it's wonderful that we are at this point, and I congratulate all of you. I'd like to start by thanking some of the amazing panelists and personalities that have graced these 2 days of the summit. A very warm thank you to Ian Drennan from the We Protect Global Alliance for all the insight that he provided us and the support that WPGA has been offering to Project Masoom. Liz Thomas from Microsoft. I think the session was amazing. It was very interesting to understand what technology leaders are planning to do to create a safe online space for children. Julie Inman Grant from the Australian eSafety Department, Mr. Cornelius Williams, Mr. Soledad Herrero, and Tanishta Datta from UNICEF. I think UNICEF has become a really valued partner for Project Masoom and Young Indians this year, and we are so happy to be working together with them again to protect children and to create a safe and happy future. Dr. Rinchin Chofal from SciVec, Ms. Anu Garg, NIS from the Government of Odisha, Ms. Uma Subramanian from Aram, Ms. Pooja Taparia from Arpan, Mr. Christopher Payne from Lego, and last but not the least, Ms. Laurie Tasharski from ICMEC. I think the insights, the experience sharing, and the knowledge sharing that we've had from all of these speakers in the past 2 days has been immense. There's a lot that each one of us have to take back, a lot of food for thought that we've gathered, and of course, a lot of things that now are on our action points for the times that come ahead. And we're really, really grateful to each one of you for sparing us this time and coming on and helping us understand this issue better and the steps that we need to take to address these issues. We would like to thank our knowledge partners, We Protect Global Alliance and UNICEF and ARPAN, who have been associated with Project Masoom pretty much from its very inception. We also take this opportunity to thank Childline India, which partners with us across the country for the millions of children that we touch and the millions of lives that we address when we do our awareness sessions. I would be failing in my duty if I did not acknowledge the efforts of our two brilliant rock stars who have been heading Project Masoom this year. Piyush and Tarang, you've taken this project, this vertical, this movement to an absolutely amazing level. You've actually taken us forward leaps and bounds into what we can do as young Indians for our children. And I think you're paving the way for a completely new era of what young Indians will be doing towards child protection and safety. I'd like to place on record a big thank you for our entire national management team. It's been so wonderful to see so many of our great leaders come on, steer the panels, moderate them, even interact with children, youth, to create meaningful dialogues, to get wonderful takeaways for each one of us. And I think any words that I have to thank them will be less, but I'd still try and acknowledge the efforts that they put in and the way they stand behind every initiative that young Indians take as pillars. A big thank you to our wonderful secretariat headed by Radhika and her team. I think their support has been unstinting, and we never hear a word of dissent from them. We always see how willing and how supportive they've been towards all of our ventures, and without their support and their diligence and commitment, we'd never have been able to realize this dream of ours of having this kind of a summit of this scale and size. A very big thank you to all our members who've supported this, all the people in the governing council who've, I think, been some of you who've been a part of Piyush and Tarang's team also, and actually, you haven't been in the forefront, but at the back of events, I think a lot of credit goes towards all of you for making this a success. And I'd also like to acknowledge the leadership and the vision of our national chair, Mr. Kartik Shah, because I think it was his vision and his whole idea for what Project Masoom could be and will be. And I think it's under his guidance and his leadership, we are very confidently marching on. So thank you so much. I think the journey is only just begun. We have a long way to go and we have many things to do, but I think together with all the amazing partners and the amazing, wonderful team that we have, this is only going to be something that we're going to do better and bigger and make a real change in this country. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for your time and efforts towards this.